More than anything, I am a space fundamentalist. Hello, everyone, and welcome to IRENCAST. I'm your host, Jeff, and with me is my co-host, Alan. On the first...
Heyo.
Nice. On the first and third Tuesday of every month, we bring to you our perspectives on theology and culture from a post-evangelical lens. Thank you for joining us for another conversation to provoke your progressive Christian imagination. This week, we're going to be talking about media portrayal of trauma and suffering. And for our segment, we're going to introduce a new one called... and we'll give context as we go this, but it's called Your Fundie is Showing, and we're going to express areas of our life outside of our Christian faith that we are still very much fundamentalists in. So I'm looking forward to that. It'll be a nice palate cleanser after I think the conversation we're going to have. We had this conversation planned before the unfortunate events in Florida recently, to talk about how the media portrays suffering and trauma. So obviously it makes this conversation a little bit more relevant and gives us a current framework to look at how these things are being portrayed and all that kind of stuff. So Alan, why don't you introduce how this conversation came to be something that you wanted to talk about on the show? Because this is something that Alan proposed that I thought was a great idea.
Some years ago, I came across the book Regarding the Pain of Others by Susan Sontag. It was recommended to me. She's a photographer and philosopher who's pretty known in the art world, at least. And she wrote a book that kind of delves into the portrayal of suffering and how it gets co-opted and used and the nature of viewing pain in general. And it blew my mind up. I loved the book. This is like 2015, maybe. Then later on, I started reading a book called The Body in Pain, The Making and the Unmaking of the World by, forgive me, Elaine Scarry. I once heard, don't make fun of someone when they don't know how to pronounce a word because it means they read it in a book, right?
Yeah, very much. I'm guilty of that all the time.
That means you're an intelligent person. You read it in a book and nobody had to tell you it. Anyway, her book is fascinating. I'm not all the way done with The Body in Pain, but the initial chapters on the nature of pain are incredible. I really like to invest myself in empathy just by the nature of my personality. It means a lot to me. It's a big part of my job. And I remember I was just thinking about this yesterday. In an earlier episode, we talked about what our superpowers would be. And my superpower would be being able to feel what other people feel or make them feel what I'm feeling.
I was just thinking about that as you were talking about that.
That's the alien episode. God, I love that episode. But yeah, the empathy means a lot to me. And so does the nature of our media means a lot to me too. And so the intersection of these two big ideas, how our public life is constructed, how we interact with that, and then also pain and empathy, it's an intersection that's really fascinating to me. So I figure for this topic, I could talk a little bit about the nature of pain in general, especially through Elaine's book. I'm going to say her first name. Sorry about that. Talk about the nature of pain in general, and then talk about consuming media portrayals of pain. I mean, who hasn't seen on their Facebook feed like a video pop up of a shooting or a disaster or a war-torn area or refugees fleeing somewhere? This happens all the time, right? We see it. It's inundating our world, and bringing a little bit of consciousness to how do we view that stuff and how does it affect us and how does it get used is more than appropriate. I think it's something we need, and it's something I need. So,
and we have, countless historical images that are burned in our brain of like Tiananmen Square and all that kind of stuff, that those images that stay with us for decades.
Right. One stood with me is there's this little girl in Vietnam, and there's a picture of her crying in the middle of the road with her hands outstretched. And I think she's like naked or something. And there's just like, there's so much just pain and obscenity in that one photo that you just want to turn away from it, right? And so there's different reasons. We can get into that in a second. There's different reasons for viewing this kind of stuff. And then lastly, I'm hoping to talk about empathy and mirroring. Like what constructive stuff can we do when we're faced with pain and when we're faced with suffering? So that's the general layout. And let's start with the nature of pain in general. So my favorite quote of all in the Body in Pain book is this: to know pain is to know certainty. To hear about pain is to know doubt. And what that means is when you're in pain you know one thing for sure. One thing is true in the whole world, that you're in pain, right? I mean, you stub your toe or something and you're like, that's the brute fact of your existence in front of your face. Like, you know, you're in pain. Pain is just undeniably real for the person who feels it. And there is no greater gulf between you and another person than their inner experience. So no matter how empathetic I am, Jeff, I will never know what your pain is like, right? I'm not your body. Your body is a different planet from mine, completely opposite, right? And so you are, in some senses, absolutely and utterly alone in reporting what you feel. I cannot feel what you feel. In some ways, we might be able to measure what's going on in your brain with imaging scans and stuff like that. But ultimately, your experience of your pain is your own, and nobody can feel it for you. So it's at the same time the most certain thing in your life. And for other people, they have to rely on your self-reporting of it. So hearing about someone else's pain introduces doubt, whether you like it or not. It's just the nature of hearing about someone else's pain. I think about the Scrubs episode. I don't know why this just popped into my brain. God, I love Scrubs so much. It's something I can come back to. JD is prescribing pain pills to this patient, right? And his mentor, Dr. Cox, is like, that guy's a drug addict. He doesn't actually need that pain. And there's that whole like conversation about, you know, do you believe the person who's in pain? Do you not? There's fascinating studies. Just as a side note, there people of color, and especially women, are less believed about their pain in general. Did you see studies about stuff like that?
I've heard about them. Yeah.
Yeah. It's fascinating. Anyway, so you're relying on, reporting of pain, and how we even talk about our own pain is, an evolving science. Like there used to be a time when we didn't have the chart, you know, the chart when you go into the hospital from 1 to 10, and there's like a happy face at 1 and a really anguished face all the way on 10, and you have to say what number you are. And then you talk about what kind of pain you have. You have to rely on language. Like, oh, it's stabbing pain, or it's burning pain, or it's dull, or it's sharp, or it's this or that. Like language itself it's just limited to explain our experiences. So connecting to other people's pain immediately has all of this gulf between you and the person who's experiencing it. And so a lot of the injustice in the world, and a lot of maybe the ignorant ways that we move around, is based on that gulf, and it just amplifies some of those problems.
Well, and I think it's also important to make a differentiation. Like we can talk about pain, like stubbing our toe or hurting our arm, or even emotional pain, like a breakup or something like that, and then contrast that to like trauma that affects us in a way that, you know, like if I tell you a story about how I stubbed my toe, I can tell that story in a narrative function. I can tell that story with a certain amount of disconnect, because it's not a pain that then becomes a part of who I am, and something that becomes replayed in the way that I move and breathe throughout my life. Like, there's a study.
Let me jump on that, dude, before you move on. That is actually super good. That's a good way of saying something that I wanted to bring up at some point, is that language transforms the nature of our pain, and pain itself robs us of language.
Exactly.
So Elaine Scarry would say that it robs us of the world. It shrinks the world. It increases our body. And part of the world is like our civilization and our language structures and stuff. And that gets decreased in pain.
Right. And there's this, book that I've read recently, called The Body Keeps the Score. And it's by a neurologist who is doing brain studies about how people deal particularly with trauma, and how it's not an event that passes. When we talk about trauma and deep pain, it itself is not a narrative. It is something that then shapes your entire narrative going forward. So you can't talk about trauma in terms of a beginning, middle, and end where it's been resolved. They did a study where they took people who had experienced some kind of trauma, and they asked them to describe a comforting memory. And the way that they described it was in narrative form, beginning, middle, end, and they talked about it in terms of story. But when they were asked to describe a traumatic event, they talked about it in terms of sensations, sight, hearing. So it was as every time they retold that or re-experienced that, then they would literally be there in their physical body. Their physical body would express and feel the same things that they did in that traumatic moment. So I think it's important when we talk about, as we lay the foundation for when we talk about trauma, is that for many people, trauma is something that is relived over and over and over again, because it literally it literally like disconnects the rational part of your brain. It is something you feel. And a lot of the forms of therapy that are out there that try to help us rationalize our past experience are somewhat ineffective if they're not grouped with something that's more holistic, that kind of eases and calms those physical things that happen as a result of the pain that we experience.
To put that in a philosophical rendering and not just the neurological scientific like understanding of it, Elaine would say that pain unmakes the world for you. We even have terms like blinding pain, right? When you're in pain, it's hard to notice kind of what's going on outside of that pain. So it's basically destroying the world for you to the point where you're just your body. Though, like you said, rather than narrative and story, your sensations. Your body has become massive and your world has become small. And you see this with people who are in pain in their old age, like in my ministry, their worlds shrink, to their recliner, to the things that are around them. Rather than projecting themselves out into the world is becoming dimmer and dimmer and smaller when they're in this kind of pain.
Right. And not only that it becomes smaller, the world becomes hostile because everything is the potential to re-experience another way or an even worse pain than your original one.
So, in the context of torture, even the extensions of ourselves in society, they get weaponized. Civilization itself gets weaponized. So a building is just an extension of your body. Like the walls, they're supposed to regulate temperature and keep out foreign objects. That's what your skin does, right? It's just an extension of yourself into a larger space. So that's what civilization does. That's what architecture does and art. And you get further and further and further out with these levels of human, experience and civilization and extension. Language is a massive importance in that because you really extend yourself with your language. And so for some of the older people, like language becomes their stories and their tellings and their ability to speak are their way of, extending themselves out in the world. That's why elders are a really important function in society. When it comes to torture, or maybe even war or things like that, civilization itself can be used against yourself in creating pain, slamming your head against a refrigerator. This is part of the book of The Body and Pain. It talks about war, torture, pain and memory, like kind of all these different topics that surround suffering. And it's like like you're saying, for the older person, even the elements of civilization itself can become weaponized or become potential places that cause pain.
Which makes, even just the very definition when we talk about pain and trauma, which makes things like get over it or it's in the past irrelevant statements to anyone that's going through pain because, first of all, trauma is not in the past. It is constant.
Not irrelevant, but violent. Pain causing itself. So the person, the torturer, the regime who uses torture, and the United States has used torture in the past. We've waterboarded people and said it was totally okay under the Bush administration. The regime who uses pain creates this sensation for this person that is undeniably real, right? Like pain is just undeniably real. It's a brute fact of existence. That through the magic of politics and regime power, that transfers some of the reality of that pain to the regime that's using it. So for the regime or for the torturer, their world is so massive that it's their disconnect from the body is acute, and their world is so massive that when they torture someone, it gives reality to their larger world. So in the person who is telling you to get over it, you know how pain makes your world small and your body is just true, like your body is the reality because you're experiencing all this pain. The person who tells you to get over it, they're saying that their world is true, like whatever's happening outside of all that pain, that's what the real reality is. And so they're causing some of that violence. I'm not saying it's a torture or something, but you can see how like there's an inverse relationship between world and body and pain, and how sometimes that stuff gets co-opted by people without even understanding it or realizing you're doing it, or maybe on purpose, like in war and torture and things like that.
Right. It disconnects people's experiences from their context. And that is horribly dangerous and counterproductive to any kind of connection or health of a group of people, whether it's a family or a church or a nation.
Yeah. And Susan Sontag said, you look at pictures of bombed out cities, right? And I'm thinking of homes of Syria, right? I'm thinking of all the bombings and stuff. And you see these pictures of people spilling into the streets, refugees, and there's just bombed out homes everywhere. And like, you can say those are, you know, the factions that bombed them are destroying Syrian architecture. Or you can say like they're destroying Syrian homes. You know, sheared off buildings and stuff like that, looking at images of that is like looking at sheared off bodies, looking at pictures of, because that's extensions of who we are. And so rather than being completely removed from it and saying, oh, this is a concept, like, no, that's somebody's home, you know? So maybe now it's time to talk about consuming media portrayal. The most insidious thing about looking at pain through certain mediums is that it actually secures the distance between us and the person in pain in a not obvious way. When we come to an image and we see people suffering, it obscures the realities that are involved. When you take a picture or you film something, when you frame something, this is what Susan Sontag says, when you frame something, you're obscuring things. You're choosing to leave some things out, right? You're taking a picture, you're purposefully leaving certain things out. And when we come to these images and these stories and stuff, especially when we don't know the people involved, there are realities that are left out that create even more of a distance from us and create a false we. Every single one of us look at the shooting in Florida or another awful video or portrait, and we all have the same gut reaction at first, right? Like a little bit of shame, a lot of shock, like this is awful, this is not something that's right, like it's affecting me on a very visceral level, and it creates a false we. We all think we're reacting the same way, right? That's the trick that happens, but it's not true whatsoever. Sontag points out that in the early 20th century, there was this one photographer who was taking pictures of these hollowed out soldiers. That's the term she uses. Hollowed out soldiers. Their faces up close. You can look at it online, and they're self-portraits of these people who have like lost eyes, and, you know, they're disfigured by these horrible world wars. And when they were first taken, they were intended by the photographer to point out the absurdity and horrors of war. They got used several generations later as fodder for patriotism, as like, look at these people who suffered for the good. And it gives me the strength to go be a soldier and be a patriot and to suffer like they did. So completely the opposite points being made. One is criticizing the machine, one is supporting it, you know? And so there's a false we that's created when, and she says this is a quote, "The illustrative function of photographs leaves opinions, prejudices, fantasies, misinformation untouched." We think we're being moved when we look at those videos, but sometimes it's just entrenching us. It's just entrenching me into me believing that I am innocent and I have a lot of distance between me and whoever's perpetrated this, or distance between this thing and me. Usually this happens in a different country, right? We're like, oh, that country, it's supposed to happen over there. It's not supposed to happen here. But it leaves all of those things happening inside of us untouched. So it's a little bit disingenuous to think that showing violent imagery is going to actually produce change in us, because a lot of times it does the exact very opposite.
I think less the opposite and more what it does, it just brings out what's already inside. Like it's a reflection of who we already are, which I think is the function of any kind of art, right? Like your interpretation that you impose on it, the things that it brings out in you, the visual nature of it is just a reflection of what's already in there. Because I'm of two minds of this. Like all the things that you're saying is a good point, but it feels like you're left with the conclusion of, well, then should we even take pictures of these things? Should we even have things that bring up those things? Which I don't think is the answer either. So I think it's more.
She says this to answer what you're just saying, but there is shame as well as shock in looking at the close-up of a real horror. Perhaps the only people with the right to look at images of suffering, and she's saying perhaps, she's not making a claim, perhaps the only people with the right to look at images of suffering of this extreme order are those who could do something to alleviate it. The rest of us are voyeurs, whether or not we mean to be.
I don't know. I think that might be a little bit over cynical, while I agree with elements of it, because I think it's more of our choice in how we consume those things. Like if we view it as a window into who we are, then it can be a road towards self-reflection and how we can better approach pain and suffering from the rest of the world that we're so disconnected from.
I agree with art, but like videos and pictures of victims, it's hard to call that art for me. You know, like art is supposed to bring out these things that are in us, right? And give us that kind of self-reflection sort of stuff.
Right.
But actual documentation of suffering, do you call that art? You know, like, is it?
Well, in the sense that it visually is something that we connect, it is connecting us to something visually that we are not otherwise connected to at all. And I think that it is in the same vein of art because it is devoid of us actually experiencing it and is only connected through the way that we respond. So again, it's a reflection of who we are, or it brings out something of who we are in there. And I think it's difficult because then I think when we're talking about the images and the video themselves, we cannot have that discussion without then also connecting it to the agenda and the motivations behind the people that are presenting those images.
Absolutely. The context and the way they present it. But
because for us, our context is money. Our context is advertising. Like what news is going to be brought to you?
Or they call it a culture of spectacle, right?
Right, exactly.
It's supposed to be this spectacle to get clicks and do this kind of stuff. So there's lots of layers that are attached to it for sure. Ultimately, though, even the person who filmed it, like, they don't even get a say in how it gets used. You know, like that's postmodernism, and it gets.
Well, they do, but not in the avenue in which it's presented, right? Like,
right. But even in the way it's used in the person who's viewing, like, they don't get to determine that. And that's kind of what you're saying in response to art. It's a mirroring of ourselves. It's something that we're looking at in ourselves. What are some of the reasons for viewing material like that? I'll just say this right now. I've had, and I guess I wouldn't call it like an inappropriate fascination, but I've watched a lot of riot videos because they fascinate me. Like the idea of a riot happening is like, just makes me curious. And so I watch it, right? And there's always the same thing that happens with riots. There's the same couple individuals that do certain actions that cause the whole group to do this. There's a couple individuals who try to stop the rioting, and they're always in danger, and they should just flee. That's like my one thing that and so when I come to those videos, part of it is like curiosity. Part of it is preparing myself or steeling myself for life. Like, what would I do in that situation? You know, like, that's a part of the human impulse to look at stuff like that. What are some of the other reasons that we look at suffering? Do we actually really want to alleviate the suffering and be a part of an answer to it? Or is that something that we're just telling ourselves? I don't know. There's those kinds of questions for motivations come into it as well. How you approach imagery.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I think that's a good question. Just for my own personal experience, I tend to avoid that kind of imagery at all costs. I remember in the early 2000s when they caught Saddam Hussein, and I was still a youth pastor in an evangelical church at the time. And I remember, like, almost not from everyone and not even from the majority, but it was a present feeling, but almost like a glee, like,
yes,
or even when they announced that Osama bin Laden. But I think the Saddam.
I know what image you're thinking of right now too.
I think the Saddam Hussein is
burned into my brain
much more. And I never watched it. I've never seen the video because they hung him, right? I think. And the video
either
was
hung or shot.
Yeah.
I never saw the video, but I do have a picture because they posted a picture on all the news sites, the same one of him and this crowd around him and stuff. Like, yeah, it's burned into my brain.
Yeah, and that's why I keep going back to that idea of reflection, because I don't understand the idea of having any kind of glee towards anyone, any kind of death or violence in that way, where you literally watch someone's life being taken from them.
Right.
And
that's what Justin Martyr said, by the way, in one of the earliest Christian fathers. He said, in our faith tradition, we don't delight in the deaths of any people, even the unjust.
Right. And I agree with that. But then I wonder and I don't want to find out, but what if the person that was being killed in front of me was someone who killed someone I know, like literally, like, and then I can't fathom whether that is something that is going to still be in me or not. So I don't know. I think that, I think
think before you move on from that example, sorry to cut you off like 12 times already in this conversation, thinking about the way that image of Saddam Hussein played into the story of America and America, what it tells itself, is a powerful thing.
Agreed. Yes, 100%.
And so all of that is invisible to us when we just come to the photograph, you know, but it's still operating in the background.
But without the photograph, would we have gotten that kind of glimpse into the psyche of our country? And without those images for us, like, are there certain images that again, they trigger something in us that we wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah.
And not to say that that's a justification either, because again, I think
that's
there are
why we
layers
have
to these
memorials and like Holocaust memorials and stuff like that. Is one of the worst things about suffering is isolation. Like the world's obliterated, right? And you're alone. And being forgotten is worse than, like, for some people in their own self-reporting, is worse than going through all of the things that happened. Torture, loss, death of family, stuff like that.
That's an interesting point. I just watched Coco. I don't know if you've seen that movie or not.
No.
It is wonderful, very powerful. But the whole central, like, metaphor theme of that movie is that idea of being forgotten. Is that, you know, it's based off the Dia dos Muertos in specifically the way that they celebrate it in the Oaxacan area is what they base the film off of. And the whole premise is like you die, but you have a second death when you are forgotten. So the idea of photos being alive or photos keeping you alive in the afterlife. And it was just this fascinating idea of being forgotten, because I think that element that you mentioned is part of why, or at least the motivation why we choose to record, why we choose to even have the images in the first place. So there's like that, there's that journey that the image has, the actual event, the recording of the event, why the event was recorded, the distributing of the event, why was the event distributed, and then the watching of the event, why am I watching the event in the first place? Right.
And then one step further, language lifts all of that even further into like reality. So for me, it's giving people the chance to tell their stories. It's one thing to see a picture or a video of a shooting. It's another to listen to the people who were there explain their story. Because when you're able to talk about your pain, you project yourself into the world and your pain lessens. Remember that like inverse relationship? When you're in pain, your body's everything, the world decreases. If you can put out there your experience and speak it or say something, it actually lessens that divide where your body is everything and your pain is everything. It actually has a healing effect. So Amnesty International talking to torture victims and publishing stories, that's healing for those people. And that is like bridging the gap between us and their pain, which is not as important as going through the process of healing and giving space to people to do that.
Level. And I think that that's an important aspect. That book I talked about earlier, The Body Keeps the Score, one of the main elements that it talks about in terms of finding healing from those traumatic moments. Now, obviously, there's a difference between putting your story out there to a collective nation of people that you mostly don't know. And then the next level and more healing part of that is having a community and relationships that are helping you through that trauma. But one of the basis of the book, The Body Keeps the Score, is the idea that healing must happen in the context of relationship. And part of that relationship is sharing, is putting it out there.
Yeah. So language is massively important. Okay. So side note, Brene Brown, she writes a lot of stuff on vulnerability and is pretty well known. She posted something when there was some sort of traumatic event in the last year, and she had a couple steps of things that you should do. One of her steps, which I found interesting, is step away from social. This is what she said: step away from social media coverage and toward real people for support, action, conversation, and being with each other in collective pain. Keep informed, but don't stay glued. Our secondary trauma will not make us better helpers. It shuts us down and sends us into self-protection and blame finding. Really good. And that's a practical way of saying some of the stuff that I think Sontag and Elaine Scarry get into, is that what does consuming media do to us, and how does it used by rather nefarious entities and structures? I think on the personal level, so secondary trauma, or they call it vicarious trauma, is when someone's helping someone and they get PTSD from their helping experience. Totally documented. It's a real thing. It's something that I shouldn't even say that, like it's not a real thing.
Well, there's a large contingency of people that that say that those things are not real things. There's a large contingency of people that still say that PSD is not a thing. So
right, I don't even want to give those people like the time of day or voice, you know. And
but they're all they're voices that are in our lives. Like we're exposed to them, especially in our context of ex-evangelicals.
Yeah, and you know, you hear it all the time: snowflakes and safe spaces. You got to go find a counselor. Blah blah blah. Like that's thinking that belongs in the dark ages. You know,
absolutely.
I don't mean to say that. I guess I say that very dismissively, but like, yeah, there is a lot of good and toughening yourself up and reacting to life in such a way that makes you stronger. And the problem is a lot of that is illusory. If you don't take care of these problems, like that stress actually affects you later on in life, whether you think about it or not.
Oh, it stays with you the whole time. And there's no acknowledgement that idea of, the pre-safe space, quote unquote snowflake era isn't the reason that we're in this place that we are in the first place.
Yeah. Okay. That's true. That's a good way to put it. Like we're here because of that kind of thinking.
Yes, absolutely.
And, so watching this stuff over and over doesn't make us better helpers. I think personally, I started before I read these books. Even now, I think it's important that this documentation exists, that there gives the people who suffer an ability to speak their stories, to share their stories, is just massively important. Because the only thing worse is suffering in silence. Oh, this was the thing. Okay, I was saying language is important, right? Stories are important. This is what I was kind of getting at earlier. There are fictional stories and real stories of small scraps of language floating off by themselves, disconnected from all context, giving people strength and healing. Right? There's nothing worse in you're being tortured. There's nothing worse in your situation than the complete isolation that it is. There is nobody else that is there to see your pain except for people that are causing it and are disconnected from it in every single way. And there's no way to speak your pain to anyone because you're not allowed to talk to other people. The isolation is incredible. And so, there's a story of a matchbox with a scrap of paper inside of it that has the word coraggio in it. Have courage, take courage. That's written by someone else. And to them, that's more important than bread. Like that's the thing that connects them to the world that's disappearing, right? That extends their body out, extends themselves out from their current situation. And so it is not a small thing to say that storytelling, that Brene Brown saying, go toward real people for support, action, conversation, and in collective pain, that has to happen. That's where healing begins. It's not the only thing, but it is one of the main things that we have to do. Is we have to be able to give story to that pain, to be able to get it out from us, and to even, make the circuitry of empathy happen.
Well, and I want to go back to the quote that you gave, about empathy in social media. I think if you're a listener of the show for a long time, you know that especially Alan and I, we're very much advocates for the benefits of social media. We're not, the type of people that will say it's all bad, it's disconnecting us from everything and all that kind of stuff, because it is a platform to people who are going through whatever suffering to lend their voice to. But I think that the flip side of that, and I think it probably where this conversation is landing as far as our own personal reaction to the topics that we're bringing up, is having some kind of discipline or method in the ways that we approach social media, in the way that we approach the images that are out there that are expressing people's pain and suffering in ways that, that invoke something in us. And I think that that's an important thing, is that we can have, just like any relationship with any kind of medium, we can have a healthy way to approach it and an unhealthy way to approach it. And I think that keeping in mind our own shortcomings and our own things and biases that we have should inform the way that we approach these images, the way that we approach social media.
And it should in the perfect world, I guess, move us into new ways of being and thinking.
Yes, absolutely.
To question our prejudices, but it doesn't. It just doesn't. The nature of this imagery does not do that unless we're equipped with the tools to allow it to do that. For instance, you look at pictures of people of color being hung earlier in this century, right? And it evokes really strong, like, wow, you're just hanging innocent people without judge or jury, right? That's so messed up. And for a lot of us, we will have a negative reaction toward that. You look at pictures of bombed out Hiroshima and you're like, does it do the same thing for you? All of these buildings that are destroyed and stuff, does it call you into question the people perpetrating that violence?
Does it alone, though? That's the thing for me, is does it alone? Like, if those images are paired with other things that you've done to understand that situation, whether it's through reading or through personal stories that you've had connected to that person, I think that the problem also is that we can't approach just one avenue of media or information in order to bolster that in us. And I think that maybe that's part of the problem too.
Yeah, of course. You can't just rely on that, for sure. But I think that for me, I want to be the kind of person who views stuff like that and it moves me in a genuine direction and it changes me. and not just reifies who I am, who I think I am. I look at those pictures of lynchings and stuff, and I'm like, oh, I'm not those white people laughing in the background. There's a lot of pictures of stuff like that. All of us in the United States, every single person on every side of the political spectrum will look at those pictures and be like, oh, that's not me, right? I'm not a racist. I'm not this. I'm not that. I wish that initial step in feeling would be conveyed to things like indiscriminate bombing of innocent people. Like, wow, I'm not that kind of an American. I'm not the kind of an American that would bomb a country indiscriminately and kill that, millions of people. It's like, or hundreds of thousands of people. That's just the elementary step, right? The next step is like, well, why am I feeling like I have to be this righteous person who could never be like that? Why can't I actually dissect some of my own prejudices and stuff? But,
well, we're just inherently bad at critical self-reflection. And I think that if we do not address that and find ways to really be critically self-reflective, then I think when we're talking about this idea of like media images and all that kind of stuff, then we're automatically going to approach it in a way where we're going to be moved, but not necessarily moved in the right direction.
Right. And we're going to be even further disconnected, because that's step one. Dude, the point is to actually get to someone else's experience. The point is to hear that person's experience, understand it as best we can, and be a part of the alleviating of that pain. That's kind of the point of all this stuff. And if you can't start with critical self-reflection, you'll never get there. We never will. The first step for me in viewing this stuff is I have to let go of my need to be right. If I go into any situation where I'm talking to someone, whether it's counseling them through their pain, I go into it being like, I don't need to be right. I don't have to defend myself. I don't have to be like, you have to be completely secure and okay with not having all the answers, with not being right, with actually coming to the table to listen, right? Before we can even interact with some of this stuff. But that's just step one. I mean, moving beyond that is work and art. Empathy is not easy.
It's a muscle that needs to be exercised.
Yeah. And this stuff is not just a mirror for us as a public listening to people telling their stories is a mirror for them. And that's very important. Not for us to inject our own agenda as much as possible, but to hear it on their own terms. And we're really friggin' bad at that. Like we spectacleize everything, and
which is
make it
the importance of media representation. Like, when we talk about, certain races and genders not being represented in media and in the stories that we tell in our culture, that does have profound
I can't start on that.
effects.
I'm going to get so upset.
Well,
I can't.
But I think it's connected.
I watched a Ben Shapiro video where his whole video is him criticizing people about being happy about Black Panther.
Oh my gosh.
And his whole video is like, basically you weren't happy and excited about being liberated from slavery.
I saw
you weren't
that.
Happy and excited about. I'm like, what? First of all, why would you even film something like that? Like, what's the point of making a video like that? See, even my dog's upset. What's the point of making a video like that other than just to show your outright racism? It's awful.
Right. But I think
anyway.
it highlights the importance of this whole conversation, highlights the importance of representation, because those images and those stories are not going to be told on the news. We can't rely on a place where people can have the forum and just to, in plain words, black and white, say, here's my story, here's the narrative part of it. Like, it has to be reflected, especially when we're dealing with pain and trauma. Sometimes we need the avenue of art so that we don't have to express it directly, but we can express it through character, through narrative, through image, through all this kind of stuff. And it's important in our exercise, in our discipline of empathy, to have avenues where we are experiencing other stories that are not ours and seeking to understand in the midst of them.
Talking about these events and talking about what we've seen and heard and experienced is important for us as a public. Like, it's no small thing to sit down with real people and to talk about this stuff and to provide spaces for healing and processing. Because there is, collective pain.
Right.
As Brene Brown talks about.
But I think we try to do that on a national level, and we don't do. I don't know if we can. I don't know if it's possible to have that, moment.
750 million people.
Exactly. Especially with in light of recent tragedies in Florida, it's you can't do that. You have to, it has to be that community doing that together. And then the rest of the country, we have to have a different conversation, a different way to approach it, because it's a different level of pain and trauma that we're experiencing being separated from it. And we just haven't we haven't, or maybe never be able to figure that out, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try and get better and find varying degrees of and platforms in which we can have people come and where we can have people come and express those things in ways that are healthy. And I think that that's part of the motivation behind the whole idea of safe spaces that have happened recently. And I think that that's a good thing. And to discount them and to take maybe a few, because we all know personalities like this that will gleam on to someone else's tragedy in order for them to have attention. And that element is true in any tragedy that happens in our country or our community, but that shouldn't negate the fact that we still need spaces where people can feel validated and that they're still connected to the larger world through their tragedy, because like you said before, their world has become so small and so hostile because of that event.
Yeah, and it allows them to externalize the pain and to project themselves back out into the world. And God forgive us if we tell other people they're not allowed to project themselves out into the world, especially people in pain.
Right, and how much more true is that for collective pain, communities that face generations of pain and oppression? That's not something that can be turned around with, a community meeting. That takes structural change in order to have those things happen. So I think that when we talk about pain and when we talk about trauma, we have to first understand the depths of pain, even though we ourselves cannot experience it, because we have the privilege. That's exactly what it is. We have the privilege to be able to look at a painful situation rationally and look at it without the lens and the emotions of the people who actually experienced it. And
your world's still intact in a really big way.
It is. So instead of using that perspective of privilege to discount the people that are in pain, we have the opportunity to connect with those people in pain and be a place and an outside voice when that person or that community is ready to then begin to reconnect their rational thought and their emotions with whatever tragedy or pain that they've experienced. Everyone can collectively do something, but we forget that timing is just as much as important as the words and the things that we do.
Timing. Yeah, man, it's hard to think about this topic without thinking about like my pastoral role and even people in my family who have dealt with chronic traumatic pain. If you have chronic pain that's really bad, it changes your whole life and it changes your relationships, and people have a hard time adjusting to that. I have friends who went through stuff like trigeminal neuralgia in their face, where they have a twitch in their face, and it like destroys all their relationships because it causes all these migraines and stuff, and people cannot relate to the kind of level of pain that person's in. Or you watch Golden Girls and you see like there's an episode where one of the Golden Girls, these three older ladies who live together, I'm sure everyone listening to this probably knows something about it, goes to the doctor and has this undiagnosed pain, and the doctor doesn't believe them anymore. And it's like, hey, you should get a haircut or something. They basically try to explain away using psychological terms or something, or in so many ways discount that person's pain. So it happens on an institutional level, it happens on the person to person level. And I honestly believe that if we were a culture who gave space to each other, to listen to each other's pain, to validate at least the fact that we're feeling that way, maybe not even agree with all the particulars, but just to be there as a good mirror, less shootings would happen in the first place. And I mean, isolation is a massive part of what all of this is about. Yes, I think that watching a video of kids being shot in a school should lead us to experiment with all kinds of ways of lessening the chances of that ever happening again. And it should move us in that direction. And I personally believe legislation, we've already talked about this a billion times. I think that most Americans agree, like 80% agree on certain elements of common sense gun reform that's just not getting passed. But the isolation part, dude, your wife, and I think it's super personal right now, once told me it was a shame that we felt like we had to drink to be able to connect with other people, that we just didn't grow up in a society where people were where people were unguarded and open toward each other, that we just didn't have that kind of support structure and system. I'm so tired of people like Donald Trump saying, why didn't anyone notify the police? There's all these signs. Why didn't someone step in? Blah, blah. And it's like, it's not just notifying the police. It's stepping in to be present in a person's life, in a constructive way. And like, I feel like we as a society could do a lot better at that. And anybody who chooses the path of empathy and mirroring other people and giving language to pain and listening, you're doing the goddamn work of healing. You know, you're doing the good work, and it matters even if it's one person. Make it 2, make it 3. Like you can change big things with small actions, and that small action being a more open society that's willing to listen to each other. That's where all of our like chips should be in, you know?
Right. And I think that the recent events in Florida with the school shooting only hammer home this idea that we've been talking about, that these images that we're seeing on a regular basis, the stories that we're hearing from this place, have only served to solidify people in the stances that they had before this happened.
Yes. Entrenched us and increased the division. Because by their own nature, we have to recognize that they do not move us on their own.
Unless we allow them to, unless we've created a way and been mindful of how we're approaching those things. And
it sounds like we're saying over and over, it takes story to do that. It takes narrative to do that, and the time and space to be able to hear it.
And if we have a leader who refuses to hear the opinions or thoughts of anyone else, then anyway, that's a side note. We're obviously
Are we talking about church or the country?
Well, yeah.
Are we talking about Christianity and the experiences of regular people, or are we talking
yeah,
oh
I don't even get me started. Sometimes I have a hard time not personifying the church as Trump. So, but that's, that's my side view. Maybe I'll cut that out.
You got work to do.
Oh, I know. I do.
We all do.
All right. Well, I think that I don't even know.
I think we're going to talk. I'm going to have a follow-up episode at some point, or maybe even just me talking, because there's still more to think about in my mind about suffering, the portrayal of suffering and the consuming of it. Like, this is just the beginning of a topic, you know? Like,
for sure.
It's important for all of us. I'm interested to know how other people are dealing with looking at violent imagery. So if you want to leave a comment,
please
go
do.
to our website.
Go to our website, add your voice to this
Facebook.
conversation. You can do it directly on the show notes at IRENCAST.com/112. That's 112. Also in the show notes, you'll find the links to all the other places you can like, follow, and contact the show. So if you want to hit us up on our Facebook page or Twitter, or just email us directly, you can find all that information on our website and on the show notes at IRENCAST.com/112. Or depending upon what podcast app you're listening on, the show notes might be a clickable link, might be right there in front of you on your phone. So yeah, we'd really like to hear from you on this particular area. Not only your personal stories, but kind of branches of conversation that we can take from this main conversation and make into an episode and continue and expand the conversation in certain ways. So yeah, we always love to hear from you. We're just so thankful for since we've come back from our hiatus, we've had so many great and wonderful people like reaching out to us and sending us emails. And it has been, it's been invigorating. It's been wonderful to experience and hear from people that have been listening. And, we really do. We're appreciative of it.
This podcast
Thank you.
Has always been self-serving for me, and I know for you and for all of us. Like, it's just a platform to start processing some of the stuff that we're going through and kind of marking where we're headed at the same time and processing together. So anytime someone responds, it's like, you're adding to my life, and I appreciate it for entirely selfish reasons.
Very much so. Very much so. So on the other side of the music, we're going to be doing our brand new segment called Your Fundie is Showing. So clearly this podcast is all about our move away from religious fundamentalism. We've moved away from a narrow view in our evangelical upbringing, and we're trying to open up the space. However, we recognize that we are layered people. We are layered individuals that have nuance and complexity, and there are areas in our life that we still approach in a fundamental way, where we are rigid, we are concise, and we have very little wiggle room for change. And we just thought this would be a fun segment. There's a saying that's happened in our family and relationship as we go on, that's been told to both of us in some way, shape, or form, because we have various areas that we're really nerdy in. And someone would always say, when we got a little bit too far beyond, they would say, your nerd is showing. So we just thought that would be a good saying to bring into this about our fundie is showing, our fundamentalist is showing. And So yeah, so Alan, let's start with you. What would you say that you still very much are a fundamentalist in?
And I thought, okay, so when I originally talked about this segment with you, I was thinking of actual ways I'm still religiously a fundamentalist. Because there are those areas of my faith where I still feel like that sometimes. And the thing that first came to mind, I know this is actually about religion, so it's not according to this segment, but it's what came to mind. I'll have conversations with people and like, I'll say things that sound super pretentious about the Bible, like super pretentious. And I feel like everything has to have biblical grounding. And so like preaching and stuff, preaching is great, but like for me, there's this impulse to be quote unquote biblical. And I'll always laugh at that word. I'll always look at stuff. Oh, you're not being biblical. Even this last week, I had people on Facebook tell me like, aren't you a pastor? That's not biblical. Like all kinds of stuff on comments and stuff. And, it's a funny word, but it's deep down somewhere in my heart.
So your instinct is no matter what good thing or biblical thing I may say, in your mind, when I get to the end of that, you will think in your mind, you should have put a verse on it.
No,
right?
it's more like, yeah, maybe a little, but it's more like how people talk about the Bible. Like I'm in a space where I know intellectually that like, the way we use texts is very different than what I was taught, like everybody is interpreting, even the people in the Bible themselves are interpreting older texts a certain way. But still, when I hear people talk about the Bible, I'm like, no, like you don't have a right to use it that way.
I think that's come out a little bit in some of our past Bible episodes.
And I'm working through it. But I still, my Fundie shows every once in a while, and I get all excited. My nerd shows way more often than my Fundie does, though. Way more often.
Really? I would say that for me, it's about equal. Like I'm a big nerd about things, but because I get to be so nerdy about certain things and I feel like I've gained a certain amount of knowledge, I also gain a little bit of, pretentiousness with those things that I've gained so much knowledge about, and a certain way.
You said offline that God, I cut you off like 100 times. Oh my gosh. You said offline that I would probably say something about the gym or whatever. Because I've been going twice a day, man. I've been waking up before 9 o'clock and running like 5Ks and stuff a couple times a week, and then working out in the evening. I feel like I'm dying. And yes, I've learned a lot over the last couple of years how to use machines and stuff like that. And so when I see people using certain machines in the gym in unorthodox fashion, it bothers me a little bit. I want to go over there and take out the manual and show them like, this is the way that it has to be done for all people everywhere. You don't have a right to like hump the lap pull down bar, because that's not what that's for. Like when you're pulling it down, you're like moving your hips at the same time. Like there's videos of stuff like that, but I see it in the gym all the time. And I don't ever want to criticize someone for the way that they're working out, but every once in a while, like, especially if the person is a very big presence, like the way that they act and are gaining attention and stuff. And then they start using a machine in a certain way. I feel like my Fundie slips a little.
See, when I
don't say anything,
the reason I mention that is because since I've known you, you've had various seasons of like intense commitment to the gym. Like it is an unwavering commitment when you're in that zone. Like, oh, this person from out of town that we haven't seen in like a decade is going to be here, and they're only going to be here from 12 to 2. You'd be like, I got to go to the gym.
Yeah, I am right there right now.
Like everything gets put on hold.
Hey, it's been that way for 2 years now. One of my favorite little memes is like, you don't exist. I'm going to the gym. None of you exist. Because I realize like, I don't take care of myself. I just don't. I take care of everyone else in my life and in my job constantly. And it's the one GD thing that I give myself that actually makes a better difference in my life. So it's holy.
And I think that it's because you find comfort in a certain measure of fundamentalism.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Dude, I think about my fundamentalist past with nostalgia all the time. Then I go home and I go to church and it's totally destroyed. But like I think about the simpler days when there was a way of doing things and you got a result from doing those things, and it was always the same way. And you can wake up and the world made sense, like every single time. So comforting. Oh, I love it. Wow, that's bad. So yeah, there's my Fundie just slipped. There you go.
Your Fundie showing, Alan.
So what's your Fundie wear?
If I'm being 100% honest, I am much more fundamentalist in so many areas of my life that I am progressive and open. And I think more than anything, I am a space fundamentalist, not like outer space, but like my space.
Feng shui.
Yeah, like the space that I work in, just the spaces. There's certain spaces in the house where I have that. And it's problematic because my wife is the opposite. Very little regard for space. It's just something that you use. But for me, it's something that I live in and that affects everything. So I get overly protective. Fortunately, she cares so little about it that she doesn't mind, which is one of the many reasons I love her.
She's a nice person.
She doesn't mind so much because it's not as important to her. Because, I figure out which way the furniture is going to be. I'm the one that puts things away in the kitchen. And my mother-in-law comes every week to be with the girls, and she cooks us dinner, and she's very great. But she complains because every about 3 or 4 months, I will just rearrange everything in the kitchen to a new place because, well, this is more functional if I have this in here, because it's on the whims of my current way in which I move about the kitchen. So she'll go to get something and it'll be gone, and it's just space. Like, I just feel like I'm more productive when I can control the space that I'm in to every particular way. And I'm that way with like our bedroom, our living room, our kitchen. Like I have determined, and I have the hardest time. One thing that I'm realizing is I'm having the hardest time as a father being okay with allowing my girls to have, like, because their room was a mess. And not that I care necessarily that it's a mess, but it just doesn't make any sense. And I'm imposing this fundamentalism on my beautiful, wonderful daughters who are 4.5 years old that don't have any sense of like organization and usefulness and efficiency. And I'm trying so hard in my heart and my mind to just let it go. And
just sit them down and be like, do you not realize that this is not the way that it's supposed to be? That is so not hard. Supposed to be here.
One of my daughters, it's a little bit easier because I can see her tendencies, and she's much more like me, where she'll tell my other daughter, no, it's not supposed to go there. It goes here, or it's supposed to be this way. And I relate so much with her when she has those moments of don't mess with my space. But
I laugh at that so much. I'm sorry. And to me, that feels like I'm the kind of person who laughs at people who do that. I'll move something an inch just to like, like people who can't move anything and it has to be the way. That to me is like, how can you live like that? I don't know. That's not what's important. It takes all kinds of people though, Jeff.
It is.
It takes some.
But I think it's vitally important. It does. I'm a space fundamentalist. No question about it. 100%. And I don't think I've even gotten better in my old age. I've gotten worse. My wonderful wife and my kids so far are extremely patient with me.
The lawn's not for walking on.
Oh, I'm so going to be that guy. And if I don't verbalize it, it's certainly going to be something that my heart cries out to my mind and creates a visceral response.
You see, Jeff, you're extending yourself out into the world by creating it just the way you want it to be. That's your self. And if you can't do that, you're going to lose the ability to be in the world, and you no longer get to own part of the world. That's what it is.
Well, it's honestly, it's very confusing to me. Like, cause I'm hold so tightly to like the way that my space needs to be organized. I have a picture on my Instagram. My wife recently started a business, and we have a shared working space now. It has been a trial for me to like remind myself, no, we agreed this is a share space, and
trial.
It really has. Like I'm not overemphasizing this for like dramatic effect. It really is something that I'm just constantly like, and my wife has allowed me to do so much when it comes to this stuff that I keep having to tell myself, would you knock it off, you big dingleberry? Like, just allow it to be. And I struggle probably more with this like aspect of my personality than I did with like lust and masturbation as an adolescent. Like, it is so entrenched into who I am, and I know where it comes from because I grew up in a very like filthy environment,
chaotic environment.
Yeah. So, but I'm really, it's really heightened now that the girls are old enough and they're expressing their agency. And I see that, I'm alone in the world of my home when it comes to like organization and stuff like that. So that
at least you're not interrupting them and being like, that's not how you stack the blocks. You do it like this.
Okay. I've caught myself moving in that direction a couple times, but again, okay. So I'm a space fundamentalist. That's where I still hold on to my tendency towards fundamentalism,
and I'm still a biblical fundamentalist,
right? Which is a beautiful thing that we can be so layered, because in my spiritual life, like if you've listened to these episodes as we've gone through this whole thing, like I can hold my image of God and the Bible very loosely and be like, yeah, it's okay. Like it's okay to have no answers, but you translate that like happy-go-lucky, like ability
to the way your bedroom's set up.
I can't do it.
It's okay to hold mystery and, not have answers and things not have a place to go. That's okay.
It is okay in my heart and my mind, but it is not okay in my house. Oh, I'm such a divided person.
Right on.
Well, I think that'll do it for us this week. Alan, how can people find out what you have going on the interwebs?
I say this every time, but Facebook is really the place. That's where I get into conversations with people. Over the past couple of weeks, people have started following. And if you hear this, feel free to send me a Facebook friend request. I may not answer it, but if you do, you'll be able to follow kind of what goes on in the conversations I'm having. You can also find me on Goodreads, Instagram. I post some fun stuff every once in a while. And then, of course, my website where I'm not just the podcast site, but the blog I started where I'm working out every single day and doing the vegan thing. Still vegan, Jeff. Still 100% vegan. Mid-February.
Another area of fundamentalism.
Oh, dude. Yeah. Actually, I'm not necessarily a fundamentalist. I even say that on the website. I'm like, hey, if I'm choosing between death and eating an animal, I'll start at the lowest point on the food chain. I'm not a radical. I'll work my way up. I may not kill someone else to eat them. That may be where I draw the line. Maybe I'll do an alive thing where they're frozen already and eat part of their body. That's totally fine. But if I don't have to, then I won't. I'm not a fundamentalist. But I am getting a lot healthier, losing weight, seeing how it's changing me. And so I write funny little blurbs at least once a month on mudbeforeblood.wordpress.com.
Sounds good. And you can follow me on all the socials at Jeff Manildi and listen on the second and fourth Thursday to my other podcast, Divine Cinema, where we review, analyze, critique, and oftentimes mourn the portrayal of faith in movies. And you can find all the information that we just talked about in our show notes at IRENCAST.com/112, or any of the show notes to any of our episodes. All that information is there. As for IRENCAST, the show, if you enjoy what you hear, recommend us to a friend or leave a rating and review on whatever platform you are listening on. We would really appreciate it. Or you can take your support of the show to the next level. Consider going to IRENCAST.com/Amazon before you make your next purchase, and just shop as usual. By using that link, we'll receive a small percentage of your purchase without any extra cost to you. That'll help us a little bit in covering some of the costs associated with running the podcast. That's IRENCAST.com/Amazon. So for this week, I'm Jeff.
I'm Alan.
Thanks for joining the conversation.